Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. This is the screen that you first get to when you log into the system. And for today's session, I'm going to be taking you through a spouse client file from start to finish. And it's going to be a really open-ended session. So if you do have any questions, feel free to either unmute yourself and jump in or just send it through the Zoom chat if that's easiest. So this is the screen that you first get to when you log into the system. And to add a new client, you just go up to this add button right here. And the key things you're going to need to put in are first name. So we're going to call our client today Ben, and last name. So we're going to put in Ben Collins. This is our client today. You can put in the middle name as well, but it's not a required field. The email field is if you're going to send the client the online questionnaire, then you're going to want to put in their email and click the Use Questionnaire box. And that way, if you add them as a client, you put in their email and you click that box, it's going to send them off a questionnaire. And basically, they'll get an email that says, "Welcome to your questionnaire, click here to get started," kind of thing. And they'll click on the link and it will bring them to a page where they have to create a password just so that their information stays secure and so that they are able to come back into it and they don't have to do it all in one sitting. And then they basically go through and fill out their profile, family tree, asset, and debt information. And anything they put in that online questionnaire will automatically populate back into your account. So they don't need to send it back to you or anything like that. As long as they save their information, it's just going to automatically populate. So it can save a lot of time with manual data entry, but you don't have to send them the questionnaire. If you're choosing not to, then just don't worry about clicking that use questionnaire box. You don't need to put in their email, and then they won't receive a questionnaire. So you can use whatever process you use now, whether that's collecting their information through a Word document or a PDF that you send them, or perhaps going through it in the actual meeting with them and collecting all their data that way, just depending on your particular client. So let's go ahead and add Ben. And now today, since we're doing a spouse client file, this means that we're doing wills for both spouses. And when you're doing wills for both spouses, you need to add them both as separate clients to the system. So if you're just doing a will for one of them and the other spouse is a beneficiary, you don't need to add them both. This is only if you're doing wills for both of them. So we're going to go and add Lauren, the spouse. So we're going to put in Lauren Collins. And then the key trigger here is if they're spouse clients, you're going to want to click on this spouse client field and then pick the name of the other spouse. And what this is going to do is it's going to link them together so that any of their shared family tree and joint asset information will automatically populate in both of their profiles. And then you've also got the option, if they're linked, to be able to sync each of the scenarios and all the appointments over to the other spouse. So you don't have to start from scratch, essentially, especially if it's kind of like a mirror will situation. The syncing is going to make things a lot faster. So you can only do this spouse client function when you're adding the second spouse to the system, because the first spouse needs to be in the system in order for you to choose them from the drop-down list. So only when you're adding the second spouse. Then we'll go ahead and add. And then you just have to pick who you want to start with. So today, let's pick Ben. We're just going to click on their name, and that's going to bring you into their profile. And if the client hasn't filled out the questionnaire, this is what you're going to start with. So if it's a spouse client file, you're going to start with Ben and Lauren, so the client and the spouse. If it's just a single file, you just start with the client. And if you had sent the questionnaire, you would see whatever the client filled out. So if they created a whole family tree, when you went and clicked into their profile, you'd be able to see that. So usually what I like to start with is editing the client's information. And you can do this in two ways. You can either click edit and it will edit whoever the blue circle is around. Or what I find easier is if you just double click on the icon of the person that you want to edit, it'll bring up more information on the side. So for anyone who's on the family tree, The key things are going to be first name, last name, and you're going to want to make sure the gender is selected. And this is just so that the wording of the will comes out properly. You've also got this also known as field. So if Ben is also known as Benny Collins, you can type that on the line and then it will come out Ben, also known as Benny. For date of birth, you can pick it from this calendar or you can just type it in. So usually I do month, day, year. So June 8th, 1970. Then it'll automatically populate that age for you. You can pick a country, you can pick citizenships, you can do multiple if you want. And then all of this other information, this is good to have on your file, but it doesn't actually affect the generation of the will. So we can keep scrolling down to residency. And residency is important because however the province is set here is how the probate tax is going to be calculated throughout the system. And this is also a key field if you're from BC or Nova Scotia, because that's how you get the BC or Nova Scotian precedent to generate instead of the default Ontario precedent. So if you are from either of those provinces, you're going to want to make sure the client's residency is changed to the correct province in order for the proper precedents to generate. So that's a key field. Also, if you want it to say Ben Collins from the city of Toronto in the will, then you're going to want to fill out this city field as well. The special circumstances section for the client specifically is a place where you could note any potential capacity issues. So this is going to be helpful, especially if you suspect there might be a will challenge down the line. You're going to want to make sure any of these issues are really well documented. And then you've got direct relationships, and it's just going to tell you who the client's tied to on the family tree. So right now there's only one other person on the family tree, and it's just showing us that Ben is married to Lauren. And we'll go ahead and save. So let's say we wanted to add a child now. Whoever the blue circle is around is who you're adding to. So if we click on Lauren once, the blue circle will be around her and we can add to her. Or if we wanted to add to Ben, you just click once and the blue circle goes around Ben. And then you go up your add button. And let's say we're doing a child. So whenever you're adding a child, it's going to ask you who the other parent is. So you've got these three options. If it's the current spouse, Lauren, if it's a new parent, so it's an ex-spouse that's going to be involved in the will, or they're a single parent. So either they're genuinely a single parent or there's an ex-spouse that's not going to be involved in the will, so you don't want to add them to the family tree. So you've got those three options. Today we're going to pick Lauren. So now we have to enter the child's information. So first name and last name, gender, the key things again. We can put in date of birth. So let's say June 20th, 2000. Then the special circumstances section for anyone that's not the client is a place where you can note relationship difficulties, that kind of thing, which is good to have notes on for your file. But really the most important thing here is this disability function. So if the individual is disabled, you're going to want to make sure that button is clicked off so that later on, if you're trying to do a Henson trust, the system's going to pick up on the fact that this beneficiary is disabled. And if you draft the Henson trust to the death of the beneficiary or to the death of the beneficiary with unlimited discretion for the trustee, then it will draft that special Henson trust wording. So let's go ahead and add John Collins. Let's say you wanted to add a grandchild in. So if you look at your list, you might notice that there's no option to add a grandchild directly to the client, but there's still a way to get them on the family tree. What you can do is, instead of adding a grandchild directly to Ben, you have to add a child to Ben, and then click once to get the circle around the child and add a child to that child. And that's how you'd get the grandchild in. Let's say John's a single parent, and then you're going to enter in that grandchild's information. Lily Collins, and then we'll just add her in. Same kind of thing for nieces and nephews. What you would do is you'd click on Ben, you'd add a sibling to Ben, and then you'd click on the siblings icon and you'd add a child to the sibling. And that's how that would work. So that's how you would add people to the family tree. If there's going to be anyone involved in the will in a beneficiary or a trustee capacity that isn't family or is really distant family, and you don't want to build out the tree all the way to get to them, like second cousin kind of thing, you can add them over on this other tab. And the key thing about the people section is you're going to want to make sure everybody that's involved in the will is put in here so that later on when you're picking beneficiaries and you're appointing trustees, you're going to be able to pick them because you've already added their information into the system. So let's say later on Jordy's going to be a trustee. So we'll add him in here. Jordy Ayton. Let's say he's a friend. And that's sort of the people section and how you'd add people into there. But does anyone have any questions so far? If you do, feel free to just unmute yourself or you can send it through the chat. So I'll keep going. The next section is assets. And this is where you're going to add in all of the client's assets. You're always going to start with the general personal effects, and this is just to remind you to gift them to someone in the will. So if you wanted, you can put in details, you can put in a value, but really it's more to remind you to gift it so that you're triggering the special clause that comes up in the will. For any other assets, depends on your client. If they're like really high net worth, you can add in all of their assets with all of their values and really give them a sense of what kind of assets they have, what the net value of their estate's looking like at this point in time. If you're dealing with more of a simple client file where not many assets, pretty much everything is just residue to spouse, residue to kids, you don't need to add in all the assets here. What you do need to do is add in assets that are going to be specific asset bequests because you need to add them in as an asset in order to then gift them when we get to the scenarios section. So specific asset bequest or registered assets that you want either confirmed or to change the designation in the will, you need to add in as assets in this section. So let's add a couple. We'll go to this add button. Let's start with a bank account. So the asset name field is really the most important field because that's how the asset's going to be referred to throughout the system. And if you're gifting it as a specific asset bequest, that's what it's going to be referred to in the will. So usually I change the asset name to call it like RBC bank account, whatever the account number is, so that if I'm adding multiple bank accounts in, they're not just all called bank account because that can get confusing. So I know this is the RBC bank account, this is the CIBC bank account, and I can do different planning or at least be able to differentiate them in the system. The balance, if you're putting in the balance, you're going to notice that the probate tax is automatically calculated for you. And then ownership, let's say this bank account is solely owned. So we'll go ahead and add this asset. Next, let's go to real estate and we'll do a home. So again, maybe they've got multiple homes. So you might want to change the name to maybe this is the family home. Then you can sort of figure out which asset this is. If you're putting in the address, this will also come out in the will. So if it's 123 Anywhere Street and you're gifting this specific property in the will, then it will be referred to as 123 Anywhere Street. If you're putting in the current value, again, that probate tax is going to be automatically calculated for you. But the key thing whenever you're adding any real estate is this mortgage/encumbrances field. So if there is a mortgage on the property, you're going to want to put the value of that mortgage in this field because it's good to know sort of what asset this specific debt is associated with, and it also has an effect on how much probate tax is calculated. The key thing to note is the next section is debts, and there's also an option to add a mortgage in there. But if you've already added it in this field, I wouldn't add it as a separate mortgage in the next section because it will double count it. So you can add it in either place, but I usually find it better to add it in here because it's associated with this specific asset and it has an effect on the probate tax. So just make sure you're not adding it in here and then adding it as a separate debt because you don't want to double count it. Let's say that this is jointly owned. So it's going to be jointly owned, and then you have to pick who the joint owner is. So you're just going to click right on this add owner, and it's going to bring up everybody that you've added into the system. So we're going to pick Lauren, the spouse. You can ignore this little person plus icon because sometimes it can get confusing if you're adding people later on. So usually whenever you're adding beneficiaries or appointees or anything like that, you're going to want to click right on the line and it's going to bring up everybody that you've added to the system. Let's do one more. Let's say we're going to do an RSP. So again, we can define it accordingly so we know which RSP this is. This beneficiary field, this is just for information. So if you're either going to confirm or change the beneficiary, it's going to have an effect. We have a question. The probate tax double counting. So it's not about the probate tax, it's about the mortgage. So if there's a mortgage on a property, and when you're adding a real estate asset, there's a field that says mortgage/encumbrances. And if you're putting the value of that mortgage in this field, then just make sure you don't add it as a separate debt in the debt section. So if this is like house 123 mortgage and you're putting in 50,000 and then you get to the debt section and you're adding a mortgage on house 123 for 50,000, then it will create a debt of 100,000. So you just want to make sure you're not adding it in both sections. Sure. And for the RSP, this beneficiary field, this is just for information. So later on, you can decide whether or not you want to confirm the beneficiary or do a new designation in the will. This is just if there's a current beneficiary in the policy, it's for information on this asset. And for the current value, let's say it's 100,000. So the probate tax always calculates automatically, but the income tax doesn't. And that's just due to the variability of different clients' tax brackets. So if you want the income tax to show up, it's going to be a manual calculation. And usually what we like to do is sort of estimate on the high end what the highest possible tax they could incur. So if it's something like an asset with a capital gain, we would do like 25% of that gain. If it's something like an RSP, we would put in 50% of that. So that way you're showing them sort of the highest possible tax that this asset could incur. And then we'll go and add. So that's the assets section. Are there any other questions here? Nope. Okay. So the next section is debts, and it kind of is similar to the assets section. It doesn't really affect the will. This is more for planning. So you'd click on add debt, and here's that option to add the mortgage, but we already added it in the other section, so I would not add it again here. But let's say we're going to do a credit card. So you can click credit card, you can enter the details, and then it will show as a debt. Then this section is scenarios. So this is really where all of the planning happens. And the idea is at the most, you plan for each of these three scenarios so that no matter what happens to the client, all your bases are covered. So you'd go through and you plan what happens if the spouse is alive upon death, and then what happens if both you and the spouse are gone, but there's kids or grandkids around. And then lastly, your kind of ultimate disaster, what happens when everyone's gone. And by creating a plan for each of these, you're covered kind of no matter what happens. So there's two ways you can go about doing this. You can click on a scenario and you can start to go through it manually. So you can drag and drop the joint designated assets, you can create your initial gift, and you can run your balance. But today what I'm going to show you is how you would run an e-plan. So that's this little lightning bolt button in the top corner. And you use e-plans if you're dealing with a client who sort of meets a typical scenario in one of these things. And basically, all that means is it's essentially most of them are going everything to the spouse, then everything to the kids, either absolutely to the kids or in some sort of trust with the kids. And then the last scenario is half to spouse, half to spouses, or siblings, half to spouses, siblings. And so even if these aren't exactly what you wanted to do, so maybe you wanted to do everything to the spouse, everything to the kids, but in the last scenario, they didn't have siblings, so you wanted to do like to a charity. You can still run one of these, and then we can go in and change the details. So this is just really good because it'll give us a starting point, so we're not starting from scratch. And you can make any changes to any of these things that you want. But it is a good starting point, so you're not absolutely starting from scratch if it's a typical scenario. So let's say that I'm going to do this one. I want it to go everything to the spouse, then everything to the children in a trust. I'm going to want to change the details of that trust, and then I'm going to change the last scenario. But at least there's going to be some things that I can use, so it's going to save me time. So I'm going to click on this and then click execute. And what it's going to do is it's going to go through all of the plans, and it's going to go through all the scenarios and create a plan for each of the scenario. And it's going to go through the appointments section and appoint people as well. So now when I click on surviving spouse, you can see things are filled out. We're not starting from scratch anymore. So for the joint designated asset section, this is dragging over anything that's joint or designated. So it's falling outside of the estate. It's given it to Lauren, the spouse. Then the initial gift section, what it's done is it's gifted those general personal effects to Lauren, just so that that special clause is going to trigger in the will. So this is good. And then lastly, for the balance, it's giving everything to Lauren, absolutely 100%. And it doesn't put a gift over in because we're going to deal with that when we go through the next scenario, because the descendants only scenario is the gift over. So this looks good. I don't need to make any changes to this scenario. So I can go to the next scenario now, descendants only. No joint or designated assets. For initial gifts, what it's done is it's gifted those general personal effects to the children. And let me just show you how you'd do it if you weren't using the E-plan. So if you needed to do it manually ever for an initial gift for a specific asset bequest, what you do is you just drag and drop over those general personal effects. And then for the type, you decide, are you gifting them absolutely or trust? It's general personal effects, so we're going to say absolute. And then you just click on that beneficiaries line. It's going to bring up all of the people that you've added to the system. But also, if you scroll down this line, it's going to give you classes as well. So with a class of children, and you can use that instead of naming them specifically. And then that's how you would do it manually. And then the balance of the estate. If you ever want to see the details of the segment, just click on that gray bar and then click on the gray bar again. And it's going to bring up the details of the gift. So for this, it's going to have created a trust for the children to the duration they set at 30. Let's say I wanted to change that. I want it to be 25 instead. And then for the mandatory payments, there's staged lump sums, 25. So 50% at 25, but I want to change that. I want to say instead at 21, they get 25%. So I can change all the details if I don't want what the E-plan's created. It's just giving me a starting point, so I can go in and make any changes. And then the gift over is first to beneficiaries issue, and then if not, to the other class members, the other children. So this looks good. And since I made some changes to this scenario, I'm going to want those changes to be reflected in the spouse's will as well. So what I can do is click this little spouse sync button. And what it's going to do is copy everything I've done in the descendants only scenario and copy it over to Lauren's profile as well. So Lauren's descendants only scenario will be the same. And what it does, it's going to copy over the residue breakdown, any joint assets between the two of them. The only thing it's not going to copy over is solely owned assets. So if one spouse owns a solely owned assets and they've gifted it to someone, then it's not going to copy over to the other spouse because it's not their solely owned asset. So I'm going to go sync, and it's going to copy this over to her. Then we're going to go to no descendants. You might not necessarily need to plan this far if it's a really big family, but this is like an ultimate disaster. And so, like I said, the E-plan is going to give half to siblings, half to spouses' siblings. But let's say I didn't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is press clear. It's going to clear that residue breakdown, and I'm going to start from scratch for this scenario. So let's say for this particular scenario, I want to give 50% to Jordy and 50% to a charity. So to do that, I'm going to create 2 segments, and then I'm going to create gifts within the segments. So basically, segments divide up the estate, and then the gifts in the segments specify what you're doing with that portion. So we're going to go add segment. I'm going to leave that name as segment 1 for 50%. We're going to go add. And now I have to specify what's happening with this 50%. So I'm going to add a gift. I'll pick Jordy for 100%. So what this means is 100% of the 50% is going to Jordy. So I'm not dividing it up even further. And then we'll put in a gift over to, let's say, to his issue, and we'll add. So now I've dealt with 100% of this 50%, but I have to go back and deal with the other 50%. So I'm not going to add a gift because I've already dealt with all this 50%. What I'm going to do is click on this grayed out segments, and that's going to bring me back to the main segments page. And now I can add my second segment for 50%. And then to pick a charity, if you've already added them to the system, you can scroll down your list and pick them. If not, you can just go to the 3 dots and then you go new charity. And then just type charity on the line. So if you have their ID, you can put it on the line too. Just ignore this ID field. It doesn't do anything. So just put everything you need to appear in the will on that name field. And then we'll add. And then we can sync this over to Lauren if she's going to want the same thing as well. Perfect. So that's scenarios. Does anyone have any questions about this section? Nope. Okay. Then we can go to appointments. So this is where you're going to appoint your estate trustees and your guardians. So because we ran that E-plan, it's going to make Lauren the primary trustee. If we wanted to add any other primaries or alternates, you just go to that add, you pick your appointee, let's say Jordy, and then depending on the condition you choose is what they'll be. So anytime you choose none, that's going to make that individual a primary trustee. If you want them to be an alternate, I would usually pick if all specified cannot act and make sure the specified is the right person. So here it's right, it's going to be Lauren. So it's going to say Lauren. If Lauren can't act, then Jordy. And you can do joint alternates, joint primaries, further alternates. It's just depending on the condition and who's marked as specified. And then we're just going to sync it over to Lauren. So the sync button for the appointments is in the bottom left instead of the top right. Then the last thing we're going to go over today is provisions. So the first thing on this page is funeral arrangements. So if you want those to appear in the will, you can type them on the line. If not, just get rid of the text and no body disposition clause will appear in the will. Include future members as if you're using class gifts and you want future members of that class included in the definition. So if we want to include future children, it would say my child, John Collins, and any other child born to me and Lauren. That's how it would define children in the will. Class restrictions, same kind of thing. Trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. This is your general trust clause that will guide underage beneficiaries that haven't had specific trust set up for them. So if you want, you could change the duration, you could do an interim partial distribution, but this is just for, it won't affect any trust set up in the will. It's just for those that don't have trust set up for them that are underage. So if they get it through gift over. And then this secondary will asset, this is if you're doing primary and secondary wills, so corporate wills, and you want to pick and choose which definitions are included in the secondary will. So if you're just doing a single will, don't worry about clicking or unclicking the boxes. It doesn't have any effect. So that's provisions. Up in the top corner, the little exclamation point, these are advisor insights. So it's almost like a checklist of certain planning information. It's contextual based on what you put in the system. And it's going to help advise you to make sure you haven't forgot anything. So if you've missed something in the system, like putting in gender, it's going to say you haven't put in a gender for Lauren. So we can always go back and change that, and that advisor alert will go away. But not all of them go away. So it's asking, is an RESP possible? Because we added in clients that are of school age. So it's just to make sure that we've thought about it. It's not necessarily going to go away, and it doesn't have any effect on the generation of the document. The next thing is just notes. So here you can make any notes on your client. Maybe you wanted to check the spelling of a certain name, or note that you had done a title search on a property. And then lastly is your download button. So this is where you generate documents and summaries. So first of all, there's 3 summaries that you can generate. The first is the profile summary, and it's going to give you all the information that the clients filled out in their questionnaire, or that you filled out for them on their behalf, like we did today. So everything on their profile, family tree members, assets, and debts. So this is great for your file. Jordy usually gives this to clients after the meeting so they can check over names, spellings, and asset details to make sure everything's correct. The next one is the graphic scenario summary, and it's going to give you a nice visual representation of the will for each of the scenarios. So if you're adding in values on assets, then this is really useful, this graphic scenario, because it's going to show you sort of what you're starting with, what's going where, and what's in your residue at this point in time. And then lastly is your text scenario summary. So this is all of the information as who the trustees are, how you've divided up each scenario. It's like the will without the legalese. It's just got all the details on everything. So those are summaries. Then you go to documents. So if you're on a trial, you can ignore this. But if you're on the flex plan, before you generate the document, when you generate the first document or summary for that client, that's when it's going to charge you the fee. But these are all the documents you can generate. Today we're going to do single will. For the signing date, you can change it. You can take it out. It's up to you. The registered asset designation, this is if you want those registered assets confirmed or to do a new designation in the will. You're going to want to make sure that box is checked. This joint designated asset confirmation, this is if you want to make sure that any assets that are joint are truly intended to be joint, not held on a resulting trust. Counterpart is if you're signing in counterpart, it's just got some wording on that. Simplified provisions is a shorter will with less definitions and powers. A will guide is a nice little guide to the clauses at the end of the will, and then a cover page is just a cover page. And you can pick your witnesses as anyone else who's a user on your account, but if not, you can just click this blank box and enter in their information in the document. And then you click generate, and it's going to give you a Word document with everything that you've done in the system. It's fully editable, so if you don't like any of the clauses, you can always change it. Let's just go through this quickly. So funds and plans, this is if you click that registered asset box. Assets passing outside of the will is if you click the joint asset box. Here's all the definitions. My children means John Collins and any other child born to, because we clicked the future children box. Here's the appointments. We pick Lauren. If not Lauren, then Jordy. Here's the funeral arrangements clause. Personal effects. So this is the special personal effects clause that generates whenever you gift it specifically in that initial gift section in the scenarios. You're going to notice when you gift to children, it's going to have this red highlighting. And that's just because you need to make a decision as to the division of the personal effects, whether it's going to be up to the trustee's discretion. If it is, you can take out A, B, and C. Or if you're going to implement some sort of lottery or something like that, then you can keep A, B, and C. Then here's the residue. So to Lauren, if not to Lauren, then this trust for the children. And then ultimately half to Jordy, half to Epilepsy Toronto. And then if I scroll all the way to the bottom, here's our nice little will guide. So it guides to the specific clauses in the will. And that's how you'd go through it. So then you'd go back into the system. You would switch over to Lauren's profile. So if you wanted to switch, you could just click up here and pick Lauren. And then I'd go through all of her stuff. So you don't need to start from scratch, but I would just go through to double check that there's not any changes with hers or that everything's the same. And then you'd go up to the download button and you generate her documents as well. And the one other thing I do want to point out is this little question mark button up in the top corner. And this button will take you directly to our help desk, where you can search through all sorts of articles that will guide you how to do certain things on the system. So like, how do I create a Henson Trust? It's going to give you a step-by-step, this is what you need to do, some pictures, this is what you need to click. So it can be a really helpful resource. So if you're ever stuck, it's a great place to check to see if it has an article. But if you still need more help, you can always feel free to email support or you can email me directly. And I'm always happy to jump on a Zoom and walk you through things. So that sort of wraps up today's session, but does anyone have any questions before we sign off? No? Okay, well, if you do ever have any questions, again, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always here to help. But thanks again for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, everyone.